Hello, I'm Dr. Roy Barsness, author of the text Core Competencies in Relational Psychoanalysis, a guide to practice, study, and research, and founder and executive director of the Contemporary Psychodynamic Institute that's sponsoring these interviews. In the first episode of this series, I spoke of the research behind the compilation of the text that resulted in the discovery of 7 core competencies reflective in the practices of relational psychoanalysis. Those competencies, or what I prefer to call disciplines, are 1, therapeutic intent; 2, therapeutic stance; 3, deep listening and affective attunement; the there and then and the here and now; patterning and linking; repetition and working through; and courageous speech, discipline, spontaneity. A separate and overarching category was that of love. I then recruited various relational psychoanalytic writers to write about each of these disciplines, and am now interviewing each of them for this series. So welcome to today's episode featuring psychoanalyst and author Dr. Karen Maroda, who contributed to the 6th core competency, repetition and working through. Dr. Maroda is a psychologist, psychoanalyst in private practice in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at the Medical College of Wisconsin. And she's been involved with the APA as ethics chair and as past president of Section 39, Women, Gender, and Psychoanalysis. She's the author of 4 books: The Power of Countertransference, Seduction, Surrender, and Transformation, Psychodynamic Techniques, and her most recent, The Analyst's Vulnerability. She's also on the editorial board of 2 major journals, Psychoanalytic Psychology and Contemporary Psychoanalysis, and has published numerous articles, books, chapters, and lectures nationally and internationally on the therapeutic process, including the place of affect, self-disclosure, countertransference, legitimate authority, and the need for clinical guidelines. Karen's work has influenced my own for now over 25 years. The first work I read of hers was printed in 1998 in the Journal of Psychoanalytic Psychology, entitled Enactment: When the Patient and the Analyst Paths Converge. It had a huge impact on me because of the sense of the power of 2 personalities, 2 subjectivities coming into direct contact with one another, and the power that was present in the therapeutic endeavor towards change. I've been an avid reader of Karen ever since, and over the years developed a lovely and engaging friendship with her. Research tells us that therapists are generally conflict avoidant, but given that psychoanalysis is fundamentally a conflict model, this does pose a bit of a problem for us, especially in relational psychoanalysis that has expanded traditional psychoanalytic theory on conflict, holding to the view that understanding intrapsychic conflict in and of itself is insufficient. Furthermore, that deep change occurs at the emotional, relational level, and that the relational analysis attends to the inevitable conflicts and impasses that emerge within the therapeutic relationship and then talk about it. In fact, neuropsychologist Alan Shore says, quote, "Although such ruptures of the alliance are the most stressful moments of the treatment, these collisions of the therapist and the patient's subjectivities also represent an intersubjective context of potential collaboration." In this, Karen encapsulates a significant practice in her statement on enactment, where she says, "Enactment is inevitable. It is a dynamic, naturally occurring manifestation of the transference and countertransference emerging into a living entity, making the past alive in present, and helps us make sense of working through these inevitable enactments." She also says, however, that facilitating conflict has about as much appeal as dropping a baby on its head. So today we're going to be talking about conflict, enactment, and the place of power, truly, in the therapeutic relationship by managing and working through conflict. Also, I want to just note before, as we begin, that enactment has historically been thought of as an unconscious event. And Karen, in her earlier writings, also referred to that, but she became in this particular chapter to also begin to talk about conflict as being highly conscious, but that we avoid it. I'm going to show you a slide here briefly, because in my work with the research, I listed the definitions of each of the core competencies that emerged through direct statements of the participants, and I referred to them as properties that evolved in the project. And here are 3 of them that came up. As deep change occurs at the emotional level, the analyst attends to the inevitable conflicts that emerge in the relational field, works through enactments, holds to the view of the necessity of destruction, survival, and recognition, and rupture and repair is inherent in any authentic relationship and leads to change. Karin, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for your contribution to this text.
Thank you, Roy. It's a pleasure to be with you as always.
Yes. Karin, one of your subtitles in this essay is Enactment and Beyond, Facilitating Constructive Conflict in the Therapeutic Relationship. You speak of the inevitability of conflict, and you suggest that this has to do with the roles that we have played in our past as soothers, peacemakers, rescuers, that are often due to our own issues of separation and loss. You refer to a potential problem that is filtrated into our practices, and that is of being the good enough object mother. And you ask us to reconsider a very important question by saying, quote, given Winnicott's concept of good enough caretaking and the extensive literature on attachment and affective attunement stern, is it possible, you ask, we might be rushing to pick up the proverbial crying infant too soon? Can you elaborate on this for us?
Sure. Well, the point I'm trying to make, and that I made further in my most recent book, The Analyst's Vulnerability, is that I think that partly because there are more women, I think I talk about the impact of women dominating psychoanalysis in a way that we have not before, and that how we've contributed to the increasing, I think, humanity and nurturing aspects and empathic aspects of the communication in the therapeutic or psychoanalytic process. I think we've also perhaps contributed to perhaps being a little more indulgent of patients and wanting to be the good mother, which is essentially, some people might disagree with, essentially a female position. So, and Levinson has pointed out too that the model has gone from being, rather strict and knowledgeable and informed person to psychoanalysis to being nurturing enough or gentle enough. So I think too that, and Mitchell pointed this out, that with the impact, which has certainly impacted my work as well, so that this is not a criticism, but that we have focused so much because it's like, oh, this is so amazing, to look at the attachment literature and to see how these patterns are formed very early in life and continue on, and how important the attachment is, and hence the relationship. And of course, the research has supported that the relationship is the primary, determining factor in the treatment. So of course, I think, justifiably become enamored with that. But I'm afraid that in the process of that, we've overcorrected and are focused too much on soothing our patients who are in distress, and perhaps too quickly and to the point of avoiding conflict. And Stephen Mitchell, he wrote a classic paper on the developmental tilt. I'm trying to remember the date on that, but it was in the 70s, I believe. And he objected to some of Winnicott's formulations and the object relations approach for that very reason. He felt that if you came in too quickly and wanted to be the good mother and soothe the patient too often, you were foreclosing unnecessary conflict. And I think that he was right, and that's continued to exist. And I think it's interesting too that in spite of all of the case presentations, about that show that are usually illustrations of good mothering or good parenting, and ones where we soothe, we're able to come up with something that is really soothing and appealing and comforting to the patient. as opposed to, being in conflict with them, that that we don't really ever focus on how that might impair separation, individuation, sense of agency, ultimate independence, and empowerment of the patient.
Yeah. Well, I think in this book, Brad and I talk about courageous speech, discipline, spontaneity, and some of that came out is that it feels like therapists speak is always supportive.
Yes.
And yet if we have a authentic relationship, like you say, if there's no conflict in an analysis, there's probably no analysis. And right. Because it's a human process, right? And I think I'm working with a fairly new patient right now, and there's all this positive stuff going on with me. And I'm feeling like I'm feeling all that positive, and I don't know how to bring this in yet, and all that sort of thing. And it would be rather to just sit back and enjoy the glory. And I wouldn't do this person any good. Yeah. How do we? Also, I think I've been working on this too, to hear your thoughts on forgiveness in psychotherapy, because so often we've supported being the victim. Mm-hmm. And in doing that, we've lost the power of what it means to actually see oneself as much as also quite a human being who can also harm and not just be the harmed one. But I think therapy holds our patients often in a very positive light, and not necessarily challenging or confronting them in their growth.
Yeah, and I think too, there's especially, and I know this is a controversial issue, but with our fascination almost with trauma currently.
Yeah. Yes.
Trauma is the most popular topic.
Yep.
Trauma books sell the best. People are just intrigued by trauma, and I think it speaks to our own pain too. That
yes,
the pain. I think trauma to me is a bit exaggerated. I think that using trauma as widely as we do takes away from truly traumatic incidents. I think there's a big difference between microaggressions and being a Holocaust survivor, for example.
Exactly, right.
The latter being, of course, hugely traumatic, the former not. I think that we've all experienced pain, frustration, being thwarted in our lives and in our families of origin. I don't know that all of those pains qualify as trauma. So I think the term is being over applied and kind of takes away from people who have truly been terribly abused and traumatized.
Yeah.
In every sense of the word. But I think forgiveness, the one thing I will say quickly about forgiveness is I think that I always tell my clients that before you can get to forgiveness, because some of them come in wanting to forgive. I had a client who came in and her young daughter had been significantly molested, possibly penetrated by a relative, and whose home they went to regularly. And she discovered later what had been going on when these children were playing. The one child who did the abuse being a few years older than her daughter. Mm-hmm. And she came in, she said, I just can't forgive this. I can't forgive the child who did it. I can't forgive the mother who kind of dismissed it as it wasn't that big a deal. Mm-hmm. And I said to her, you have to get to the rage and the helplessness before you can get to forgiveness. And I'm a huge believer in redemption. I think there's a natural course that people follow that once they can really express and integrate their rage, their helplessness, their guilt about what happened, the fact that they couldn't keep it from happening.
Right.
And may have even colluded in some form that they feel shame about. When they work through the guilt, the shame, the rage, then they can come to forgiveness.
Yeah. I think we've also had this idea of forgiving and forgetting. And I talk about forgiving and remembering. That's a very important distinction, I believe, as well, which involves a much grittier kind of work because you do want to dissociate it. You want to get it away. And yet, no, it really is for real. And then your affect around that is intense, right? As you work that through.
So do you want to talk for a moment about our early experiences and how I think they contribute to our avoidance of conflict? You had mentioned that earlier.
Yeah.
And I think, and again, this is outlined in more detail in my current book, The Analyst Vulnerability. The whole first couple of chapters are about this, which is that, but I'll keep it very basic, and you alluded to it, is that we were chosen because of our strengths, largely, because we were the children in the family, or the child in the family who was uniquely sensitive, emotionally sensitive and empathic and responsive and not too high maintenance.
Right.
Who then demonstrated that sensitivity and then subsequently was engaged to be the family peacekeeper, soother, comforter, and many people, Jacobs, Olnick, and many others have referenced, and I believe Stoller will also have referenced that the therapists, and there's research to back that up, the therapists were their mothers, often their depressed mothers, soothers. But we've never really taken that concept beyond that. It's like, okay, that's impacted our vocational choice, right? We had that role, but how does that actually translate into how we think about treatment, what our own personal dynamics are, how we interact with other people, especially our clients? And in this book, I write about how it has tremendous impact, not only on both our theory, our choice of theory, and our technique, but that I feel that there are universals that I've come to believe in as a result of many years now as a senior analyst, treating and supervising. Most of my practice for years now has been treating other therapists and supervising other therapists.
Right.
And I've noticed that as different as we all are, there's this common theme of feeling guilt and shame about two major things. One, that we couldn't cure our family members. And that as children, we thought we should be able to and wanted to, as Searles would say, that was our goal, was to restore. And of course, inevitably did not have the power to do that. And we would have success at times, I think, which is what created the motivation for the vocational choice. But inevitably, we had to fail. We weren't in a position to fix this, right?
Which is also true in therapy, right?
Yes, right, exactly. And then we recreate
which is unbearable for us.
Exactly, because we want to make it right. We want to fix it. Our self-esteem, speaking of redemption, we can redeem ourselves by fixing our patients. But we can't. The problem is it's a fool's errand. And the more we try to do it, the worse we perform. The more we try to rescue and save our patients, and in so doing, save ourselves, the more likely that treatment is to fail.
Well, one of the things you say in here, I should mention not only analyst vulnerability, but also in this essay, you refer to this historical handicap in a way we have. And you also, and I appreciate Sussman's book on A Curious Calling that really dives into why the hell are we doing this and choosing this, and what is its impact on our work.
And Sussman points out too that we don't really talk about it. If you ask therapists, even analysts, why did they choose this vocation? They will give very surface answers. I like people. I like to talk to people. I like to help people. There aren't any intrapsychic.
Right. You don't have a good, that's a good point. Yeah. Well, one of the things I've always liked about a line that you use here, it's we tend to confuse being nice with being useful. And you go on to say there should be a statute of limitations on providing a holding environment. And I just want to highlight, because I think that's really good and a really good thing for us to remember, that the conflict, again, is inevitable, and that being nice isn't necessarily being useful.
Right. And although I must say that I attribute that term to, that's not my original comment. No, the statute of limitations. I quote Hirsch.
That's right.
Erwin Hirsch came up with that. But I quoted frequently because I firmly believe that that's true. And I think that we all experience that, is that when you start a treatment, you want to create this, more, I guess, nice. You do want to be nice, right? You want to be empathic. You're not going to start challenging early in the treatment. You're not going to start challenging or engaging in conflict with a new client. And I don't think we talk enough about how treatment, analytic treatment, especially long-term, is a developmental process.
Yeah.
And so maybe in the beginning, we focus on being empathic, being understanding, forming a positive attachment with the client, creating an atmosphere of safety. But when Hirsch says statute of limitations, it's like, well, aren't there functions that follow developmental functions? Doesn't it technically grow and expand to include conflict? And ideally it does, but I think too often we don't discuss that or even seriously consider that needs to happen.
Yeah, thank you. You do a really nice job in this chapter on the considering and reconfiguring projection. That is such a powerful term within psychoanalysis. And the two-person movement redefined this whole idea of projection and projective identification. And you state not as an attempt on the patient's, that projection is now not seen as an attempt on the patient's part to dump negative affect on the analyst and attempt to ruin the treatment, but rather a more innocent attempt at unconscious to unconscious communication of unbearable feelings. And that we began to view the patient not as someone intent on ruining the treatment, but rather as a co-creator of the relationship, trying desperately to communicate in any way they could. I think you've just done such a nice job of that in this essay. And I believe this is a very important shift in relational psychoanalysis. What are your thoughts about that?
I do too. In fact, it's interesting, Jacobs, who in 1986 coined the term enactment, said that it really is mutual projective identification, which I elaborated on in that 1998 paper that you wrote so much, which is that it's this collision of our unconscious, and it's a repetition not only of the client's past, but also our own in that moment.
Yeah.
And Jacobs, referenced that, and he said enactment is mutual projective identification. Unfortunately, we watered down that definition, but I like to keep his original definition.
Yeah.
To that kind of discrete event, and he noted, I think, Riley, that since it became mutual projective identification, one of the reasons he named it enactment is he said mutual projective identification was not going to be a popular idea.
Yeah, right.
And
I like that.
It still really isn't, because if you look at the many conversations we're having about enactment, there's very little reference to it really being a mutual projective identification.
Yeah.
Very little.
Yeah, it's so true. And I just using that word that Shori did, and then you just brought it up, collision. Historically, we've seen it as a collision and a problem of the patient. And this idea that it's actually a communication ripe for collaboration.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think we could also add, and I think we all experience, one of the topics that I've been examining and that Slavin and Friedman also discussed in detail, and not often quoted, by the way, is that there has to be this degree of mutual influence.
Yeah.
That we both want to influence each other. And ideally, our desire to influence is to help the patient work through, but it's not always. And that's part of the basis for conflict, because each person in the dyad necessarily wants to maintain homeostasis, right? We don't change easily. And that's a good thing, or we would be unstable.
Yeah.
And we're mutually trying to influence each other, and that naturally creates conflict.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting thing that historically, whenever we meet a person, there's already something going on.
Yeah. Yes.
Right away.
Right.
And so to say that I'm now going to analyze that person and their mind, where am I then now? Where is my subjectivity in that? Because I just that person just impacted me and I impacted them. And that seems to be where the work gets to be worked. And you introduced to me enactment that you have, and Theodore Jacobs is the one who you brought forth in that. But you say this, it is an affectively driven repetition of converging emotional scenarios from the patient's and the analyst's lives. Two people come together and there's kind of a spark. What are we going to do about that? Right?
Right. And I think, unfortunately, I mean, people often feel that I've contradicted my 1998 position. And to some extent, I have, but only in the sense of emphasis. In 1998, I wanted to help bring out, along with many other people who were writing about it, that this is enactment is inevitable. And it's particularly inevitable with the kind of patient who cannot identify and express their feelings. They have no choice really but to enact. And they can be good at provoking them, excuse me. But currently, my view is that because enactment is one of the things that results from our childhood is a certain passivity, right? Because we couldn't be in charge of our parents. We couldn't take control. So I believe there's quite a bit of learned passivity in all therapists. Yeah. It has to be overcome, and ideally would be addressed in training. So I think that it's my belief that we have, as Richard say, valorized enactment and relied too much on it because we don't have to facilitate anything. We don't have to do anything. The idea in the Boston Change Process Study Group supports that notion too, that somehow if we just create this, empathic, attuned relationship, that enactment will follow. And our job isn't to facilitate conflict. Our job is to try and work through enactments. And I think that, of course, to some extent, that's true to the extent that enactments are inevitable. But I do not believe that all enactments are inevitable. Some are.
Yeah. In fact, what I've enjoyed in your development of understanding that is your desire to challenge the idea that strong countertransference emotions are almost always out of awareness and are unconscious and can only be known after they've been enacted. And you're arguing, no, it's both conscious and often very conscious, but we're avoiding it.
Yes. In fact, I've now spoken to so many groups about this. I mean, literally, like probably thousands of people.
Right.
And the kind of joking thing I always say is, and I often start presentations with this too. Think about a recent enactment or powerful enactments you've had with people you've worked with. Put that in your head. Now ask yourself, were you aware of these negative feelings prior to the enactment? Were you aware of being frustrated, angry, depressed, alienated, any, the negative feelings that create an enactment?
Yeah.
And I always say, well, I'll give anyone like $1,000 or $100, whatever, if they can tell me they had an enactment and that those feelings were completely unknown to them.
Right.
It doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen for two important reasons. One is we're hardwired to pay attention to negative feelings for survival. That's one of the neuroscience findings that's interesting. So we pay very close attention to anything that's threatening. That's one reason. And the other reason is that because we're so passive, enactments are much more likely to occur when you're stuffing something down. So, and because we're uncomfortable with having negative feelings towards our patients, just as we were uncomfortable with being angry with our parents for needing us and burdening us. We feel guilt and shame and discomfort with the negative feelings, and we think we're supposed to be all accepting, unconditionally loving. And again, I think erroneously believing that that's a good stance, that's a good therapeutic stance, when it truly isn't. So,
and often end up in a very masochistic state where you're feeling very punished by your patient and you're trying to be the nice person and not acknowledging that your niceness is actually contributing to the whole historical relational world of the patient. Yes. I remember go ahead.
Yeah, and you're actually withholding your authentic self from the patient. But of course, the counter argument, the fear, which I think is exaggerated, this fear of doing harm, is that I think in part because we stuff so much down that often people come to like dread seeing that patient, have feelings of hatred toward that patient. And the thoughts they have in their mind, and people do, even though they, and they will admit to it, the very aggressive, even murderous rage that sometimes, emerges is so powerful and so scary
Yeah.
that they think, how can I possibly express this constructively to the client?
Yeah.
But, and you can't just say, like Mitchell said to a patient that, if I saw you, if I treated you like this and you weren't my analyst, what would you say? And he said, I'd probably say, fuck you.
Exactly, right? Yeah.
And so are we going to go around saying fuck you to our patients? Of course not. But
We'll find a way.
Is that these countertransference disclosures that need to be made have to be somewhat planned out, because we're often late to the game, late to the awareness of them. Uh-huh. And if we're very late, of course, there's going to be all this intense rage that we need to modulate and focus on what's really happening between us. Try and figure out how much of this is our own past and our own dynamics, and then focus on the patient and find a constructive way to break the impasse through, a constructive expression of anger, not an assault, right?
Yeah, I write about, and in the book, about my fourth patient who absolutely terrorized me, and all I did is withdraw. And fortunately for me and for the patient, that she hung in with me until I said, okay, I'm not here, this sort of thing. And the patient, oh, finally, I've been telling you that through all these aggressive actions that you're not here. So now that you admit it, can the work begin, kind of thing, right? Yeah. And it did. But it was my absence that just drove her absolutely crazy.
Right. And that's what precedes enactment. And I think that's why we are so in love with enactment, because we've withdrawn in these situations where we've completely withdrawn and don't even want to see the person anymore.
Right.
I mean, we're not happy with that. We're not comfortable with that. So when an enactment finally occurs, when you have that conflict, even if it's uncomfortable, it leads to re-engagement. And so then both people feel better because you're re-engaged.
Yeah. And we have to be really careful, because at that time, as you were talking earlier about how trauma focused we are now, when I was beginning training, the borderline personality was the big topic all the time, and how impossible they were to work with and all this sort of thing. And so it's easy to say that the patient was causing this and how impossible she was. And in something in me, even as an early clinician, I go, it's not just her. I'm here too, and I'm scared of her. And how do I do this with her? And I still hear from this patient 30 years later, because the work really worked nicely. But which comes to my mind. Do you have a case at all in your repertoire that might describe some of this kind of thing we're talking about?
Yeah, you posed that question to me, prior to our meeting, and I was thinking about something that was maybe a little nuanced, but not, that could bring some of these themes together. And so I decided on this patient who I have had enactments with, in the past, fewer and fewer as we've been working together for years. But this happened maybe a few years ago, probably about maybe 5 years into the treatment. And it didn't happen often, but sometimes I would say something to her. She was kind of, prickly, but I would say something to her. And sometimes I had some little pent up irritation with her, and I would be sarcastic, or, I can be a little snarky when I'm really frustrated and angry. I mean, that's true. And, she would take great offense to these things. And she would tell me how hurt and upset she was. And then she would always ask for an apology. So, and this whole thing about, you have to take responsibility, own your part. And in those times where I knew I had been a little too critical or a little snarky, or then I think, oh, yeah, that's true. Or if I think maybe not as much as she's saying, but still it was there, I need to step up and acknowledge my role. But over time, I noticed that there were some times when she would just, out of her own, unstable self-esteem, so to speak, out of her own narcissism in a sense, she would take something I said in a negative way that was not intended at all, or in my mind. And so the first time that happened, and Margaret Black had a case like this. What do you do when the patient says, I know you were doing this and you need to apologize? And if you're going to be authentic, you can't apologize if you don't believe, right? You can't.
Right.
And so one time when she took something wrong that I had never even crossed my mind. And I said, well, I'm sorry that, I said something hurtful to you, but I can't really apologize, because I don't believe that I, had this intent. And I know that's a hard read. That's a hard call to make, but I think you have to do the best you can.
Well, that's good.
And I noticed that if I wouldn't apologize, she would get angrier and angrier. Mm-hmm. And she would start out by crying or being tearful, but then she would rise up on the couch, trying to get up higher than I was, and then kind of look down at me and with a really angry look on her face and say, you really hurt me. You hurt me and you need to apologize. Mm-hmm. And I thought, and after that, first time I did it, I subjugated myself, and I felt really bad about it. I thought, I've got to think this through because this did not feel good. And the next time she did that happened, I looked at her and I said, you know what? I said, let me tell you what I'm observing. You say you're hurt and there are tears in your eyes. But if I could show you what your face looks like right now, you look extremely angry. You're arching your back, and rising up and staring angrily at me and demanding an apology. And I think you're more angry than anything else. Mm. And that, you want me to submit to you. And, there's a lot of power stuff going on here. And you want me to submit to you because you were initially offended. And I can't do that. And I think you're not in touch with your anger and your need for power in this relationship. She immediately calmed down, which of course tells you that mm-hmm. Either calming down or laughing. I always think those two things. You
right.
Her, right? And she said, oh my God, she said, that's what my mother does.
Yeah.
And she'd always told me about her mother could not tolerate any criticism of any kind, nothing. Or any, and she said, that's what my mother has always done to me.
Yeah. And in that, I would say that you were being pulled into that mother role, right? But also from your own history, there's something affectively that was also stirring. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah.
And how you were thinking? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But that brings us to the point too of how much do you have to disclose of that to the patient?
Yeah.
And I think most of the time the patient isn't looking for that. Occasionally they are. I've had patients say to me, I understand the feedback you're giving me and why you feel the way you do, but quite frankly, it seems like an overreaction to me. Like there's some issue of yours. Uh-huh. That I will always say, yes, I think you're absolutely right. And then very rarely they'll say, well, can you tell me more about that so I can understand it better?
Right.
And I will, but I don't go too deep. I found that most people do not want any detailed.
No, I think what our patients want is the relational experience that's happening, not our disclosures of our personal issues, for sure. Karin, we only have a few minutes left. As we come to an end on this whole issue of conflict and working it boldly, I would say, directly with our patients, and trying to be useful instead of nice. Anything that you'd like to leave with our listeners today that you would like to challenge them on and invite them into as therapists? I think
it's the issue that you're talking about. The position, there's much to be said about, being sacrificing at times, to allow the patient's experience into the room. But I think ongoing sacrifice that does not feel good, should be a key, should be a signal that that you're subjugating yourself rather than, really confronting the patient honestly And rather than self-sacrifice, the position that I advocate for is what I call compassionate authenticity.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And to be thoughtful about countertransference responses, particularly negative ones, and to not do it cavalierly or sometimes not even do it spontaneously if you haven't thought about it prior. But I urge people to be courageous, basically, and say,
yes. But you also
you're going to have that when you do a new interaction, or you say something that you know is going to result in conflict or anger. There's that the butterfly feeling in your stomach, right. And often that's a signal that shuts people down. And I'm saying, when you feel that fear, that's part of the work.
Yeah. Well, I think in your book, The Power of Countertransference and the Relational Movement, using our countertransference rather than analyzing it, and I think that's even the case that you presented, is that there's something powerful that the patient is bringing to us as a communication of their own intrapsychic and interpersonal conflicts. And the power is to really use this affective countertransference reactions as grist for the mill, as opposed to be interpreted away, if you will, or not thought of. But it's powerful how our patients come into our lives and what they stir in us. And like I've always said, when something comes up to me, I thought I wasn't having this feeling until I was with this person. And so even though it's mine, it has something to do with my patient and my patient and me.
Of course. And that we're constantly stimulating each other and in our own ways, differing for each person because of the asymmetry, but working through our issues.
Yeah, simultaneously. Karin, I always love being with you, and I'm really grateful for our time today. And so thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for the contribution to this book. It's resulted in a new institute. It's lots of people reading you, lots of reading. I have a lot of pleasure in the Contemporary Psychodynamic Institute that has come from this book and all that sort of thing. So your contribution is deeply appreciated, and all of the work that you do, as you know, I love it. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Royce. It's good to be with you, and I certainly appreciate your support and kind words.
Yes. All right. Bye-bye.